The knock came at 9:30 on a Thursday night, and Violet Kendrick stood frozen in the middle of her kitchen with a cast-iron skillet in her hand, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She already knew who it was. She knew it before she crossed the rough-hewn floorboards. She knew it before she pressed her ear against the door and listened to the rain hammering down on the porch overhang. She knew it the way a woman knows a storm is coming 3 hours before the sky turns green, the way she knew things in her bones that her mind refused to accept. She had been telling herself for 6 months that Clarence Redmond was a trap she would never walk into again. She had been telling herself that the man had a dark past wrapped around him like a second skin, that his hidden motives were as thick and tangled as the mesquite brush that choked the creek bed south of town, that to let him back through this door was the same as pressing her own hand flat against a branding iron and holding it there. She had told herself all of that. She opened the door anyway. He stood on the covered porch in the absolute downpour of a late October storm, hat gone, dark hair plastered to his forehead. His canvas coat soaked clean through to the shirt beneath it, water running off the brim of nothing because there was no brim, because the hat was gone, lost somewhere between his ranch and her front door in the middle of a Texas night that had no business being this cold, this loud, this relentless. He was 6 feet of soaking wet trouble standing in her doorway with mud on his boots and no explanation on his face. And the worst thing, the most damning, irreversible, catastrophic thing of all was this. He did not speak. He did not offer a single excuse. He did not reach into that considerable arsenal of smooth, measured words she knew he possessed and pull out something to justify why he was here, why he had come to her door on a night like this after 6 months of nothing, after 6 months of absence so complete it had its own weight and shape. He just stood there, soaking wet, and looked at her like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world, and she stepped back and let him in anyway. It was October of 1882, and the town of Millhaven, Texas, sat at the edge of the caprock like a stubborn old nail that refused to be pulled from weathered wood. The cattle trade had made the town, the cattle trade sustained it, and the cattle trade would likely one day bury it under its own prosperity or its own ruin, depending on which season caught you. The railroad spur had come through 4 years prior, which brought a certain kind of civilization and a certain kind of lawlessness in equal and simultaneous measure. There were 2 churches, a bank that had been robbed once, a general store run by a German immigrant family named Hofer, a saloon called the Compass Rose that did most of its real business after dark, and approximately 412 souls who would tell you they knew each other's business, while simultaneously holding their own secrets so close they'd fossilized into part of the body. Violet Kendrick had come to Millhaven 3 years ago. She had come from San Antonio, carrying a leather traveling trunk, a certified teaching credential from the Big Sur County School Board, and a grief so fresh it still bled if she pressed on it wrong. Her husband, Thomas Kendrick, had died of a fever in the spring of 1879, leaving her at 26 years old with $240, a house that belonged to his family, and an absolute refusal to accept charity from anyone. She had applied for the teaching position in Millhaven because it was the first one she found that paid enough to cover room and board, and she had arrived with every intention of working, saving, and never again allowing herself to be in the position of owing anyone anything. She taught 17 children in a 1-room schoolhouse on the eastern edge of town. She boarded with Margaret Hofer, the German storekeeper's wife, for the first 8 months, then rented the small house on Cressa Lane from the widow Patton who had moved to live with her daughter in Abilene. The house was modest. 3 rooms, a kitchen that was also the dining room, a bedroom, and a small sitting room she used for reading and grading papers. The porch faced east, which meant she got the morning light through the front windows and the privacy of the lane in the evenings. She was not unhappy. She had carved herself a careful, controlled life, and she kept its edges clean. Then Clarence Redmond had ridden into Millhaven in the spring of 1881. He came with a reputation that preceded him by approximately 40 miles, which is roughly how far sound traveled in that part of Texas when the wind was right and people were talking. He was 32 years old, a cattleman who had built the Redmond spread from nothing, starting with a crew of 6 riders, a lease on open range, and the kind of focused, relentless ambition that makes some men rich and makes other men deeply uncomfortable. He had bought the Harker parcel, which was 4,000 acres of good grazing land just west of the caprock, and he had paid cash money for it, which was the detail that got into people's mouths and stayed there. The dark past was not rumor. Or rather, it was rumor, but it was the kind of rumor that had something real and hard at its center. People said he had been in some trouble down in Val Verde County years back, something involving a land dispute, and a man who had come off worse than the land. People said he had ridden with a rough outfit in his early 20s before he'd gone straight. People said all manner of things, and Violet, who was not a woman who put much stock in town gossip, had filed it all away under the category of not her concern. She had met him at the Hofer's store in April of 1881. She had been buying chalk and writing paper. He had been buying coffee and a new lead rope, and they had both reached for the same bolt of cloth at the end of the counter that Mrs. Hofer used as a dividing space between the dry goods and the hardware section, which was a peculiar way to meet a person but no less valid for it. He had smiled at her, a real smile, not a performed one. She had thought, quite clearly and with no ambiguity, this man is going to be a problem. She had been absolutely right. They had not fallen into anything fast. Violet was not a woman who fell. She moved carefully, deliberately, the way you move across creek stones when the water is high, testing each one before you trust your weight to it. Clarence, for his part, seemed to understand this without being told. He called on her correctly, through the proper social channels of the time, arriving first at the general store when she happened to be there, then later at church on Sunday mornings, then after 2 months of that careful, measured courtship, at her door on a Wednesday evening with his hat in his hand, and a very good reason, which was that she had mentioned her porch railing was coming loose, and he had brought tools to fix it. He fixed the railing. She made coffee. They sat on the fixed porch for 2 hours and talked about everything except the things that mattered most, which was its own form of honesty, she thought. They were circling the truth of each other the way you circle a fire for warmth without getting close enough to burn. By summer, he was coming by twice a week. By late summer, they had sat through 3 thunderstorms together on that same porch, watching the lightning split the caprock sky, and she had found herself thinking, with an urgency she recognized as dangerous, that she could not remember a single time in her life when silence with another person had felt this completely, devastatingly comfortable. He told her things, not everything but things. He told her about his mother who had died when he was 9. He told her about learning to work cattle with a neighbor rancher named Hobbs in exchange for meals, starting at age 11. He told her about the early years when the spread was nothing but an idea and a lease, and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that you either had or you did not. He told her, obliquely, that he had made choices he was not proud of, that there were years he did not speak about freely, that his past had a section fenced off with posted signs that he was not ready to lead her through. She respected that. She had her own fenced sections. What she did not tell him was that the grief was not entirely grief. That the careful life she had built was not only about independence but about protection. That Thomas Kendrick, God rest his soul, had been a good man with a terrible secret, a drinking problem that had come on slowly and then all at once, that had turned the last year of their marriage into something she had told no one about because you did not speak those things aloud in 1879, and you did not speak them aloud in 1882 either. She did not tell Clarence that the reason she moved so carefully around trust was that she had given it once, fully and without reservation, and had watched it get used up without being replaced. The betrayal had not been malicious. Thomas had been sick and ashamed and unable to ask for help, and she had loved him and also been afraid of him in those last months, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and she had never found a way to put them in a sentence together. She did not tell Clarence any of this. What she did tell him, on a warm August evening with the horses in the far paddock throwing their heads at the heat, was that she was not looking for someone to take care of her. That she had arranged her life very precisely, and that any disturbance to that arrangement would be unwelcome. He had looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not offering to take care of you, Violet. I'm offering to stand next to you. There's a considerable difference." She had not responded, but she had thought about it for 3 weeks afterward. It had been good in the fall of 1881. It had been something that did not have a simple name. He came to her porch and she made coffee and sometimes supper, and he brought things from the ranch, fresh eggs, a cut of beef, once a ridiculous number of squash that his cook had grown in excess. He danced with her at the autumn social, which made the town talk in ways that were neither charitable nor inaccurate, and he had looked at her across the schoolhouse floor that had been cleared for dancing, and she had felt, for the first time in years, the particular vertigo of someone standing at the edge of something wonderful and terrible at once. She had not let herself fall. She had been so careful. And then November had come, and with it the thing that broke it all open. His ranch hand, a young man named Cal Briggs, had come to the schoolhouse at noon on a Tuesday with a message that made no sense. He said Clarence had asked him to tell her that he was going to be away for an indeterminate period and that she should not expect to hear from him, and that he was sorry, and that was all. That was all. She had stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse with 17 children eating their lunches inside, and read that message 3 times looking for the hidden meaning, the explanation, the peace that made the shape of it sensible. There was no such peace. There was nothing but the flat, cold fact of it. He was gone, and he had not told her why, and he had sent a ranch hand instead of coming himself. She had felt something close very carefully inside her chest, like a shutter being latched against incoming weather. She had gone back inside and taught her afternoon lessons with perfect composure. 6 months had passed. She had been fine. She had been careful and controlled and exactly as solitary as she had always been before he came along, and she had told herself, every single night when the thoughts came regardless of instruction, that she was better without the disturbance. That the trap she had seen from the beginning had simply revealed itself on its own schedule. That Clarence Redmond's hidden motives had shown themselves in the most clarifying possible way, which was the way of sudden, wordless abandonment. She had been fine. She had been absolutely, devastatingly not fine. Now he was in her kitchen, dripping creek water on her clean floor, and she was standing 4 feet away from him with the cast iron skillet still in her hand, and neither of them had spoken a word since she opened the door. She set the skillet down on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood was very loud. "You are making a considerable mess of my floor," she said. "I know it," he said. "I apologize for that." His voice was the same. She had not prepared herself for that, for the way the timbre of it would hit her like a hand pressed flat against a bruise. Low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had no interest in filling silence for the sake of filling it. "There is no excuse for you being here," she said. "No," he agreed. "There is not." She stared at him. The fire in the kitchen stove threw orange light across his face, and she could see the exhaustion in him, the specific kind that went deeper than tired and into something that had been carried for a long time. There were new lines around his eyes. Or perhaps they had always been there, and she had not allowed herself to memorize his face as thoroughly as she had pretended not to do. "I'm going to get you a towel," she said, "and you're going to tell me every single thing." She said it the way you state an ultimatum, flat and final, with no room for negotiation, because she understood with complete clarity that if he spoke carefully around the truth tonight the way he had always carefully spoken around the truth, she would put him back out in the rain. She was not built for the kind of waiting that had no known duration. She had done 6 months of it, and it had cost her something she was not fully able to name yet. She got the towel. She put water on for coffee. She sat down across the kitchen table from him and she waited. He ran the towel over his hair, over his face. He set it on his knee. He looked at the surface of the table for a moment and she recognized this, the gathering of courage that looks like stillness, and she waded through it without prompting him. "My brother," he said, "came to me in November." She had not known he had a brother. "Older brother," he said, reading her expression. "Daniel, we were not close. He left Val Verde County before I did, and I did not see him for near on 8 years. Then he showed up at my door in November with a problem that he had not got there honestly, and he was the kind of trouble that spreads to people around you if you do not manage it fast and away from everything you care about." She kept her face still. "What kind of trouble?" He looked at her directly for the first time since she had let him in, and the directness of it was its own kind of force. Daniel had been working for a man named Creel down in Uvalde County. Creel ran a ranching operation that had a second operation underneath it, the kind that moves things it should not be moving, cattle that were not his, horses that were not his, and some of it significantly worse than that. "A rustling operation," she said. "At minimum," he said. Daniel wanted out, and Creel was not a man who let people out clean. Daniel came to me because he had nowhere else, and also, I will not be dishonest with you, Violet, because he thought I had enough standing and enough resources to buy him out of it. He was not entirely wrong, and he was not entirely right." She felt the story beginning to take its shape in her mind, the hidden motive that had not been what she feared, which was something to do with her, with the abandonment of her specifically, but something older and darker and far more dangerous. "And you had to go to him." "I had to go to Uvalde County," he said, "and I had to sit across from a man named Creel and negotiate the terms of my brother's departure from his operation, and I could not do that while maintaining any visible connections here that Creel's people might use for leverage. I needed to look like a man who stood alone." The word leverage hit her with the full weight of its implication. "He would have used me," she said. "Not a question. If he'd known I was calling on a school teacher in Millhaven," "Yes," Clarence said. "He would have used you as a forced choice. I was not willing to put you in that position." She sat with that for a moment. The coffee water was beginning to steam. The rain outside had not slackened. "You could have told me." "I could not," he said, "not without explaining everything. And if I had explained everything and Creel's people had come asking, I needed you to have nothing to give them. I needed your ignorance to be real." She understood the logic. She hated the logic. "That was not your decision to make alone." "No," he said quietly. "It was not. That is why I am here." 6 months later, she said, her voice was even. She had worked very hard to make it even. It took 4 months to negotiate Daniel out and another month to make sure Creel would not reverse course. He is in prison in San Antonio now, Creel is. Federal marshals. It has been handled. And Daniel, something crossed his face that she could not immediately name. Daniel is in New Mexico territory. He is alive. We are not close and we will not be close, but he is alive and clear. She got up and poured the coffee. She set his cup in front of him and sat back down. And the other month, between Creel going to prison and tonight, he wrapped both hands around the cup. She noticed the small, involuntary thing of it, the way someone holds warmth when they have been cold for a very long time, not just from rain. "I was afraid," he said. "That is the truth of it. I rode up to Millhaven 4 times in the last month. I got within sight of the town water tower twice. I turned back both times." She had not expected that. She had expected pride or calculation, and she had been prepared for both of those, had her responses arranged and ready. She had not prepared for the plain admission of fear from a man who did not traffic in it openly. "What were you afraid of?" she asked. "That I had made the choice for you instead of with you, and that you had every right to close the door in my face, and that I had no earthly justification for standing on your porch asking for another chance, and that I wanted one anyway, and that wanting something you have no right to is the specific loneliness I have been living in for the last 6 months. He looked at his coffee. "That is considerably more than you asked for." "It is exactly what I asked for," she said. The fire popped in the stove. The rain continued its argument with the roof. "You should have come to me sooner," she said, "when Daniel first arrived. You should have come to me and said, 'Something has happened and I need to manage it carefully and I cannot explain all of it right now,' and I would have needed that to be enough for the time being." She paused. "That is hard for me, to accept half a truth, but it is not impossible. What is impossible is the silence." "Yes," he said. "The silence felt like a verdict," she said. "It felt like you had decided something about us without consulting me." "I did," he said. "I decided to protect you from something without asking if you wanted protecting. I understand that was wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. This careful, exhausted, soaking wet man at her kitchen table, who had come to her door in the rain with no excuse and with his hands open. And she thought about the 6 months of careful, controlled solitude that had felt like discipline and tasted like loss. She thought about what it meant to trust a person with the genuine shape of your fear. Not the managed version of it, not the presentation of it, but the actual thing. She thought about Thomas Kendrick and the shutter she had learned to latch. She thought, "This is not the same man and this is not the same story." She thought, "I am so tired of being afraid." "You are going to have to do better," she said finally. "I know it," he said. "I'm not speaking in generalities," she said. "I'm speaking specifically. If something comes up, something difficult or complicated or dangerous, you come to me. You tell me what you can tell me, and you tell me honestly what you cannot tell me and why, and you trust that I am a grown woman who can manage information without falling apart. I'm not fragile, Clarence." "I know that," he said. "I have always known that." "Then act accordingly." He looked at her with something in his face that she had seen once before, in August, across the schoolhouse dance floor. Something that had no clean category but felt like the opposite of the 6 months that had just passed, warm and present and specific to her and no one else. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the formality of it would have been laughable except that his voice when he said it was not formal at all. She could feel herself wanting to move toward him the way a compass needle moves toward north, not because it is told to, but because that is the nature of the needle. She stayed in her chair and drank her coffee. There was time for all of that. She was 30 years old and he was 33, and neither of them was going anywhere tonight, not in this rain, and she had learned the hard way not to rush through the careful, necessary work of knowing a person. "You will sleep in the sitting room," she said. "The storm will be past by morning." "I am grateful," he said, and he meant more than the roof. She got him a blanket from the cedar chest in her bedroom, moving through the house with the easy competence of a woman who ran her own domain and did not apologize for it. When she came back to the kitchen, he was adding wood to the stove, which he had done without being asked, which she noted without comment. She handed him the blanket and a spare pillow from the chest at the foot of the sitting room cot. "There is leftover cornbread on the counter," she said, "and a cold pork chop from supper. Eat something." She could feel his eyes on her back as she walked to her bedroom door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "I am glad you came," she said. She kept her back to him so he could not see her face when she said it. She heard him exhale, slow and long, like a man setting down something very heavy. "I am glad you opened the door," he said. She went to bed. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the rain and to the small sounds of him moving around in the sitting room, and she felt the particular quality of a house that was no longer empty, and she let herself feel it without fencing it off. She slept better than she had in 6 months. In the morning the rain had gone and left the world with that scoured, clear quality that comes after a serious storm, the light sharp and cold and honest. Violet was up before 6 as she always was, dressed, and with the coffee on before the sun had cleared the caprock's edge. When she came through the sitting room, Clarence was already up, the blanket folded on the cot with a neatness that said something about him, and she found him on the porch with his forearms on the rail she had never asked anyone else to fix, looking out at the mud-bright lane. She brought him coffee. They stood side by side on the porch and drank it without speaking, watching a mockingbird conduct a furious investigation of the storm-washed yard. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A proper one." You gave me one last night. An explanation is not an apology, he said. I explained myself last night. I want to be clear that the explanation does not excuse the choice. I should have found a way to let you know I was not gone by choice. I should have trusted you more than I trusted my own judgment about what you could handle. I am sorry, Violet. I am genuinely and specifically sorry. She looked at the mockingbird. Accepted, she said, and I want to say something in return. He turned his head slightly, listening. I am not easy to be close to, she said. I know this about myself. I keep a great deal fenced off, and I do not hand out the key casually. And when someone crosses a line I respond with distance rather than confrontation, which is its own kind of cowardice. When you went away, I shut everything down rather than going to your ranch and demanding an explanation. I could have done that. I chose not to. She paused. I am not sure which of us was more afraid. He was quiet for a moment. I suspect we were about even, he said. She smiled at the mockingbird. I suspect so. He left after breakfast. He had to get back to the ranch. There were cattle coming down from the summer pasture, and his foreman needed direction on the sorting. He stood at the gate in the morning clean lane with his hat back on, dried from the night's warmth, and he looked at her where she stood on the porch with her coffee. Can I call on you? He said. Properly. Can I start again? She considered him with the long, level consideration of a woman who has thought a great deal about exactly this question. You can come to supper on Friday, she said, and I will expect you to be here when you say you will be here, and gone when it is appropriate for you to be gone, and to tell me the truth when I ask you things. Those are reasonable terms, he said. They are minimum requirements, she said. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard it in 6 months, and the sound of it hit her right in the center of her chest like a hand pressed over a healed bruise, tender rather than sharp. Friday evening, he said. 5 o'clock, she said. He arrived at 4:58. November moved through its cold, bright days, and Clarence Redmond came to supper on Fridays and then on Tuesdays as well, and the conversations between them shifted in register from the careful, testing exchanges of people relearning trust to something richer and less guarded. She told him about Thomas. She did not tell him all of it at once, but she told him in pieces over the course of 3 or 4 weeks, the good years first, because there had been good years, and then the difficult end of it, and each time she told him a piece of it she watched his face and saw nothing there that made her afraid, no discomfort at the revelation, no retreat into judgment or pity. He listened the way few people listen, with his full attention, and without the barely suppressed urge to offer solutions. When she finished the hardest part of it about the last year, he said, "You have been carrying that alone for a long time." "Yes," she said. "You do not have to anymore," he said, "if you do not want to." She said, "I am still deciding what I want," he said. "I will wait." He told her more about Val Verde County, about the rough years, the bad outfit, the land dispute that had cost a man something he described only as significant, and that she understood to mean serious physical harm at minimum and would not press him on, because he had come away from it and had spent the subsequent years building something entirely different. And she believed, watching him, that the building itself had been a form of penance, deliberate and sustained. He was not the same man he had been at 23. She was not the same woman she had been at 26. They had both been forged by things they would not have chosen. December arrived with a cold front that frosted the caprock grass and sent the cattle pressing south for water, and Clarence came to her door on a Wednesday that was not his scheduled Wednesday, with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that she recognized as the look of a man who has decided to say something he cannot unsay. She let him in and she waited. He sat at her kitchen table, which was his table now in the sense that it was the table where he sat, and he turned his hat over in his hands twice and then set it down with a decision. "I would like to court you in the formal sense," he said. "With the intention of marriage, if you would consider it. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking you to consider it." She sat across from him with her hands flat on the table. The stove was warm. The house was quiet. She thought about the shutter she had learned to latch, and about how latching it had kept the cold out but also the light, and about how 6 months of lightless cold was not the future she intended for herself. "I am not a woman who will give up her teaching," she said. "I know that," he said. "I am not going to relocate to your ranch and become someone who manages a household and nothing else," she said. "I will continue to teach. I will continue to have my own views about things and to say them aloud." "I would be alarmed if you stopped," he said. "I have conditions," she said. "You have had conditions since the day I met you," he said. "I have been meeting them fairly consistently." She felt the smile before she could stop it. "You have," she admitted, "fairly consistently." "Then I will continue to," he said. "So you will consider it." She looked at him across the kitchen table that was not her kitchen table alone anymore, at this man who had come to her door in a rainstorm with no excuse and no pretense and nothing in his hands but the honest shape of his own wanting. "I will consider it," she said. She considered it for 11 days. She went about her teaching and her grading and her regular careful life, and she thought about it the way she thought about difficult problems, from multiple angles and with full attention. And at the end of the 11 days, she arrived at the same answer she had probably arrived at in the first 48 hours, but had needed to verify through the full consideration process. He came to supper on a Friday in the middle of December. There was a cold wind and the smell of coming snow, and she had made a beef stew that had been on the stove since noon, and the kitchen was warm with it. He sat down and she served them both, and they ate for a while in the comfortable silence that had become one of their finest shared achievements. Then she set down her fork and looked at him. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "I am saying yes," she said. "To the formal courtship with the intention you described. I am saying yes." He was still for a moment in the particular way of a man who has braced himself for something and received the opposite. Then he said, "All right," and his voice was not steady, which was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen from him. "All right," she agreed, and she picked her fork back up and finished her stew, and he did the same, and the snow began to come down outside the kitchen window in small, quiet flakes that made the lane glow, and she thought, "This is what it feels like. This specific warmth. This is what it was supposed to feel like all along." They became formally engaged in January of 1883, with a ring that Clarence had ordered from a jeweler in Dallas, a plain gold band with a small garnet set in it, because he had been paying attention when she said once that she found diamonds ostentatious, which she had said in passing 6 months before he disappeared, and which he had stored away with the careful attention he gave to everything she said. She put it on her left hand and stood in her kitchen looking at it, and the feeling was so different from the first time she had worn a ring on that hand, not better in a simple sense, but real in a way the first time had not always been. The women of Millhaven had opinions about the engagement, which they shared with Violet in a variety of formats, including the direct, the oblique, and the concerned friend variety. Mrs. Margaret Hofer, who was both sensible and kind, said only that she was glad Violet had found someone who seemed to understand her, and that was the finest thing anyone said. Others noted the age difference, which was 3 years and approximately no one's concern. Others noted his past, which Violet declined to discuss. The Reverend Hartwell said he was happy for them both and suggested a spring wedding, which seemed practical given the weather. They were married on the 15th of April, 1883, in the Millhaven Methodist Church, which had been decorated with early wildflowers by Mrs. Hofer and her daughter. Violet wore a dress of deep blue wool, because she was a practical woman and blue wool was more useful afterward than white silk. She carried a small bunch of Texas bluebonnets because they had just come in, and because they were the color of certain mornings on the caprock when the light was right. Clarence stood at the front of that church in his best dark coat and watched her come down the aisle with the specific quality of attention he gave to things he found extraordinary, and she had learned by now to hold his gaze when he looked at her that way rather than looking away. The ceremony was brief and honest. Reverend Hartwell performed it without excessive decoration. When they exchanged their vows, she said them looking straight at him, and when it was his turn, his voice was steady and low, and she heard every word. There was a dinner at the Compass Rose, which had been closed to regular business for the evening, and decorated to within an inch of its life by several enthusiastic volunteers. There was dancing. Clarence danced with her the way he had at the autumn social 2 years before, except that now there was no careful distance between them, no performance of propriety for the town's benefit, and when he held her for the last waltz of the evening and she had her head tilted up toward him and the room had gone soft and warm around the edges, she thought, "I opened the door. I let him in. And this is where it led." She told him as much later in the dark. "I knew when I knocked," he said, "that I had no right to ask what I was asking. I just did not have anywhere else to go." "You came to the right place," she said. They moved into a new arrangement that was, in the way of all real arrangements, a negotiation. She kept her teaching position, which the school board had been momentarily uncertain about given that she was now a married woman. But she had made a clear and reasoned argument in a meeting with the board chair and 2 board members that her marital status had no bearing on her ability to teach 17 children to read and cipher, and the board had, to its credit, agreed. Clarence drove her to the schoolhouse on mornings when the weather was bad and picked her up in the afternoons when he was able. She continued to live in the house on Cressa Lane through the spring, while the ranch house was being expanded, because Clarence's house was a working rancher's house with 2 rooms and insufficient space for a second person who had opinions about how a home was organized. He hired a carpenter from Abilene, and they spent 3 weeks of April arguing amiably about the layout of the addition. She wanted a larger kitchen, and he wanted a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides of the house. They ended up with both, because it turned out neither of them was willing to be unreasonable when the other had a genuinely good point, which was a quality of their relationship they were still discovering with something approaching delight. She moved to the ranch in May, and the house on Cressa Lane was rented to the new second-grade teacher who had come up from San Angelo. The ranch was 4,000 acres of good caprock grass, rough and magnificent, with a creek that ran cold and clean through the eastern section, and a view of the open sky that made her feel, on certain mornings, like she was standing at the edge of the world, and the edge was beautiful rather than threatening. She learned the rhythms of it, the cattle drives and the branding season and the particular urgency of spring calving when Clarence was sometimes up and gone before 4 in the morning and back after dark, and she kept his supper warm and met him at the door with it, not because she was obligated to, but because she chose to, which was the only way she would do anything. She learned the names of the hands. There were 6 of them. 2 were Mexican brothers named Luis and Arturo Vega, who had worked for Clarence for 3 years, and whose skill with horses was something she watched with genuine admiration. There was a former Buffalo soldier named James Dupree, who had mustered out of the 10th Cavalry and was the best tracker on the spread, and whom Clarence treated with the uncomplicated respect of a man who judged people by what they could do, and not what the world had decided they were worth, which was not the common practice in 1883 Texas, and which Violet noted as one of the things she loved best about him. There was a young hand from a farming family named Pete Whalen, who was 19 and enthusiastic, and learning the cattle work with the dedication of someone who had found his calling. And there was Clarence's foreman, Hector Arriaga, who was 45 and taciturn, and appeared to have decided within 2 weeks of Violet's arrival that she was good for the ranch and its owner, because he began speaking to her with a directness he did not apply to people he was merely tolerating. She loved it. She had not expected to love it as much as she did, the land and the life of it, the scale of the sky and the smell of grass after rain, and the way the horses watched her from the paddock with their patient, ancient eyes. She loved teaching. She also loved this. Both things could be true. She had learned slowly and not without difficulty that abundance was not the same as greed, that wanting more than one thing was not a character flaw. Summer came and went on the ranch with its weight of heat and work, and in the fall she discovered she was expecting a child. She told Clarence on a September evening on the new covered porch, the one that wrapped around three sides of the house, because she had learned that the best conversations between them happened in the open air with the sky above them. She said it plainly, without ceremony, because that was how she said things, and she watched his face, and what she saw on it was not the complicated thing she had half feared, but something so direct and clear it needed no interpretation at all. He took her hands in both of his. He held them with great care, the way you hold something you understand to be precious not because it is fragile but because it is irreplaceable. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "All right then," he said, and he was not entirely steady again, which she had come to understand was his tell for the deepest things, the ones he had not prepared for, and she found it more endearing than anything he had ever rehearsed. She continued teaching through the early months, until December when she arranged for a substitute teacher and put the classroom in the hands of a capable young woman from Fort Worth who had just completed her credentialing. She intended to return in the spring, and she said so clearly, and no one who knew her doubted it. Their son was born in March of 1884. He arrived on a cold, brilliant Tuesday morning after a labor of 8 hours that Violet managed with the same focused, practical determination she brought to everything else, with the assistance of the town midwife, Mrs. Carlyle, and the presence of Mrs. Hofer, who had insisted on coming, and whose presence turned out to be genuinely useful, because she made coffee and kept order among the ranch hands, who had gone collectively to pieces in the yard in a way that was touching and somewhat inconvenient. Clarence had been allowed into the room at the end, at Violet's request, and he had held his son for the first time with the careful, overwhelmed attention of a man who has never before held anything this small or this important. "What shall we call him?" Violet said from the bed. She was tired in a way that reached all the way to the bone, but she was also, underneath that, lit from within with something that had no name in the available vocabulary. He looked at the baby. "I thought you might have an opinion," he said. "I thought we might have it together," she said. They settled on Elias Thomas Redmond. Thomas for the man she had lost, because she had loved him and he had been real, and his life deserved a place in the ongoing life she was building. She had thought Clarence might hesitate at that, and he had not hesitated for a single moment, which told her everything she would ever need to know about his character. Elias was a good baby in the sense that all babies are not good, and all parents say this. But he was healthy and loud and interested in the world from the first week, and Violet was back in her classroom by May with Elias in a basket behind the desk and Mrs. Vega, Lewis's wife Rosa, watching him in the afternoons when the teaching required Violet's full attention. The school board had, once again, needed to be addressed. She had once again addressed them. The result was the same. Life on the Redmond spread moved through 1884 with the accumulating weight of a year that is building itself properly, steadily, with enough small difficulties to keep it honest and enough good things to keep it worth having. Clarence expanded the cattle operation, buying a small neighboring parcel and running a new fence line that took most of August. Violet organized a lending library in the schoolhouse, which required a significant donation campaign, and ended in success primarily because she was persuasive in writing as well as in person. James Dupree and a woman named Clara Finch, who was a seamstress in town, became engaged and were married in the fall, and there was a small celebration at the ranch that was one of the finest evenings Violet could recall. They had their arguments. She would note this because it would be dishonest to omit it. They were two people with strong opinions and the genuine willingness to express them. And there were evenings when the kitchen was loud with disagreement about things that ranged from the significant. A decision he made about a land investment without consulting her that she categorized as a mistake he would not repeat, to the entirely trivial, the correct way to store flour in a dry climate. The arguments ended when they were finished, without residue or artillery stockpiling, because they had both developed a deep and practical dislike for the kind of unresolved conflict that sits in a house like smoke and spoils everything it touches. She told him once, during a disagreement about the land investment issue, that she needed to be his partner in the full sense of the word, not consulted on the domestic arrangements, while the actual decisions of the operation were made without her knowledge. He had listened and he had said, "You are right and I have been careless about that. I want to correct it." And he had corrected it, in the specific, practical sense of changing the actual behavior rather than just agreeing to in principle. The spring of 1885 brought a drought that lasted 11 weeks and nearly took a third of the herd before the rains finally came in late June, and the whole county had the hollow, exhausted look of people who have been fighting something large and invisible for too long. Violet organized a food-sharing arrangement among the farm families west of town, because several of them had lost kitchen gardens to the heat, and she was not willing to watch people go hungry for want of organization. Clarence contributed beef from the ranch, which he could afford to do and which he did without being asked. The Hofer family's store extended credit to 4 families that summer who would not otherwise have been able to feed their children. The German immigrant who ran it said this was simply what you did, and Violet agreed with him completely, and she would tell her son Elias about it years later as an example of what decent people look like in practice. By the fall of 1885, the drought had broken and the land was recovering, and there was a general collective exhale across Millhaven and its surrounding range. Clarence sold a cattle drive to the railroad spur that covered the season's losses and left a modest profit, and Violet sat with him at the kitchen table going through the accounts, and they were both aware that they had made it through something that had broken other operations, and the awareness of it had the quality of shared history, the kind you can look back on from a distance and see clearly for what it was. Elias was a year and a half and beginning to walk with enormous conviction and very little trajectory, which kept his parents engaged in ways that were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. He had Clarence's coloring, the dark hair, and Violet's directness of expression, the particular look of a child who is paying close attention to everything, sorting it, filing it away. He called Clarence Papa with a frequency that Violet noticed produced in her husband a softness he did not bother to conceal. She was expecting their second child by late fall of 1885, which they learned with the same shared equanimity they had brought to most things by this point, a certain steady, practical happiness that had room for the complexity and the uncertainty, but was not destabilized by them. She continued to teach. She had by this point 11 years of teaching experience and was the most senior educator in Millhaven's school system, which comprised 2 teachers for 43 students. The school board had stopped attempting to address her employment with each new development in her personal life, possibly because she had made her position so consistently and clearly that there was nothing new to say. Their daughter, Frances Margaret Redmond, named for no one but herself, though the Margaret was a nod to Mrs. Hofer, arrived in June of 1886, in the same room as her brother, attended by the same midwife, with the same cast of ranch hands conducting themselves with the same tender, helpless concern in the yard outside. She arrived with a great deal of energy, and immediately distinguished herself from her brother by screaming with what could only be described as opinions, which Violet took as a promising indicator of character. Clarence held her with the same overwhelmed attention he had given Elias, and Violet watched him and felt, as she felt often by now, the specific deep-rootedness of a woman who has come to inhabit her life rather than merely occupy it. Frances grew quickly and loudly, and with the particular conviction of a second child who has sized up the available territory and decided it will be hers. Elias, at 2 years old, regarded his sister with a cautious, scientific interest that would characterize his relationship with her for the next 40 years. They were different in temperament and similar in stubbornness, which Violet noted was the exact combination most likely to produce both conflicts and alliances, which was, she thought, what siblings generally were. The summer of 1887 brought something Violet had not anticipated, though in hindsight she would say the signs had been there. Hector Arriaga, the foreman, came to the house on a June morning with his hat in his hands, and his face arranged in the careful neutral that she had learned, meant something significant was coming. He told Clarence that 2 of the east fence line sections had been cut in the night and that 3 steers were missing, and that the cuts were clean and deliberate, and not the work of wire deterioration. Clarence's expression did not change in any visible way, but she felt the shift in him, the specific quality of attention he gave to threats. "Any tracks?" he said. "Archero followed them south about 4 miles before they crossed onto the Mercer parcel," Hector said. She was listening from the kitchen doorway and she came fully into the room. "Is this the first time?" she said. Both men looked at her. "Third time this month," Hector said, after a brief pause that told her he had been calibrating how much to say in front of her and had decided she was owed the full answer. "Third time," she said, looking at Clarence. "You were going to tell me this morning." "I was going to tell you after I knew what we were dealing with," he said. "Tell me now while we are both finding out," she said. She kept her voice even. This was the edge of an old disagreement and they both knew it, he told her. The fence cuts had been happening for several weeks, always in the same section, always at night, always with steers missing. The Mercer parcel to the south had been sold in February to a buyer from out of county named Stiles, and no one in Millhaven knew much about Stiles except that he had arrived with money, hired a small crew, and had not been particularly interested in introducing himself to his neighbors. "You think this Stiles is behind it," she said. "I think it is worth finding out," Clarence said. She thought about Val Verde County, about the dark past that was not entirely past, about a man who had spent the years since deliberately building something decent and legitimate. She thought about the particular kind of trap that can be laid for a man who has a history that can be used against him, the way accusations can stick to certain kinds of backgrounds. "You should go to the sheriff before you go to Stiles," she said. "Document the losses first. Put it in official hands before any direct confrontation." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that is the right sequence." They went to Sheriff Co. that same afternoon, Violet and Clarence both, with a written account of the fence cuts and the missing cattle and the tracking evidence that Archero had gathered. Sheriff Co. was a methodical man who did his job without theater and who received the information with the appropriate seriousness, and said he would ride out to the Stiles property himself. What they discovered over the following 2 weeks was this. The man calling himself Stiles was a figure from a land speculation scheme operating out of Wichita Falls, using purchased land as a base for a relatively small but dedicated rustling operation that was reselling cattle to a buyer in New Mexico territory. The scheme was not sophisticated. Sheriff Co. found the evidence he needed within 10 days and the arrest was made without incident or drama, which was the best possible outcome and the one that Violet had been working toward through her insistence on the official documented sequence. She said nothing self-congratulatory about it. She did not need to. Clarence said, "You were right about the sequence." "I know," she said. "I would have ridden over there myself and confronted him directly," he said. "I know that too," she said. "That would have been the wrong choice," he said. "Yes," she said, "but you listened, so it does not matter." He looked at her with the look that she had been the recipient of for 4 years now, and that still had the same effect on her nervous system as the first time she had seen it, the directness, the specificity, the complete and unperformed quality of it. "What did I do to deserve you?" he said. "You came to my door in a rainstorm," she said, "and you were honest about having no excuse, and I made a judgment call." "Best judgment call of your life," he said. She considered this with the serious face she used when she wanted him to think she was genuinely deliberating. "It is competitive," she said. "I also made a very good call in 1881 when I decided to purchase a proper cast iron stove rather than using the existing one." He laughed, which was her favorite sound on earth, and the dispute about his best qualities relative to the stoves continued through supper and into the evening and resolved itself, as most things between them resolved, in warmth and laughter and the kind of ease that can only be built from years of choosing each other daily. The fall of 1887 was kind to the ranch. The cattle came in from the summer pasture in good weight, and the prices at the railroad spur were strong. Elias, now 3, had attached himself to the barn cat with a devotion that the cat accepted with imperial condescension, and Frances, at 16 months, had begun to walk with the same directness of intention her mother moved with, straight toward the thing she wanted, no detours. They hosted a Thanksgiving dinner at the ranch that year that included the Vega brothers and Rosa, James, and Clara Dupree, the Hofer family, old Pete Whalen, who had become a permanent fixture of the operation, and Sheriff Coe and his wife, who turned out to be fine company. The table Clarence had built in the enlarged kitchen barely held them all. The noise was considerable. The food was excessive. At some point in the middle of the meal, Violet looked down the length of that table and saw the specific composition of it, the people she had gathered, the children, the hands, the friends, the large, deliberate, chosen life of it, and felt something so complete and quiet and full that it did not need to be said aloud. Clarence was watching her from the other end of the table. He always knew when something was happening in her face that she was not fully expressing, and he raised his coffee cup slightly in the manner of a private acknowledgement, just for her, and she raised hers in return. 1888 brought Pete Whalen a sweetheart, a girl from a farming family named Alice Marsh, and Violet helped organize the wedding because Alice's mother had died the previous year, and the girl needed someone steady to help with the arrangements. The wedding was small and very sweet, and Pete Whalen cried openly and without apology, which made everyone like him more than they already did. She fell pregnant for the 3rd time in the late spring of 1888, and she received this news with genuine happiness and also with the practical calculation of a woman managing a household, a teaching position, 2 small children, and a cattle operation. She began to think seriously about whether the teaching position needed to be restructured, and arrived at the conclusion that what it needed was an assistant, which she proposed to the school board, and which was funded partly through a small county appropriation, and partly through a fundraising campaign she organized herself. She taught through October, and then handed the primary instruction to the assistant, a young woman named Dorothea Wells, who was 22 and terrifyingly capable, and managed the school's administrative work from home until February. Their second son, Robert James Redmond, arrived on a February morning in 1889 with the same healthy loudness as his sister and the same immediate air of having assessed his new surroundings and found them acceptable. He was named Robert because they liked the name, and James for James Dupree, because Clarence had wanted to honor the man and James himself had been speechless and moved when told. Elias, now 5, received his new brother with the grave scientific interest that was becoming his signature approach to the world. Frances, 2.5, received him with a proprietary enthusiasm that suggested she had decided he was hers to supervise. Robert received both of them with the equanimity of a baby who does not yet understand the politics he has entered. The spring of 1889 was when Violet found the letters. She was not looking for anything. She was reorganizing the cedar chest that had come from her house on Cressa Lane and now lived at the foot of the bedroom wardrobe, and in the bottom of it, underneath the spare blankets she rarely used because the ranch was warm in all but the worst winter nights, she found a bundle of letters tied with a piece of leather cord that she recognized as from the ranch's supply, brown and practical. She recognized the handwriting on the top envelope. They were letters Clarence had written during the 6 months he was gone. She sat down on the bedroom floor with the baby on her hip and Robert, not yet 3 months old, and looking up at her with his father's serious dark eyes, and she read them. They were not sent letters. They were the letters he had written and not sent, across the 6 months of his absence, addressed to her but never put in an envelope, never given to a courier, kept instead in the cedar chest like a secret conversation that had been held alone. They were dated. The first was from November, 2 days after Cal Briggs had delivered his message to the schoolhouse. The last was from the day before he had ridden to her door in the rain. They were the most honest things she had ever read. He had written about the Creole situation and about Daniel and about the specific, constant fear of what he might return to find. He had written about her teaching and about the way she looked at problems, about a conversation they had in August about the nature of courage that he had apparently been thinking about for months. He had written about the ranch and the cattle and the way the caprock looked in winter. He had written in the third-to-last letter, dated in January, "I have been trying to decide what I am afraid of most, and I think it is this. That I have built something here, this ranch, this life, that I am genuinely proud of, and that I let you think you were not part of it. You are the most important part of it. You have been since August. I do not know how to say that to you in person without feeling like I am asking for something I have not earned back yet." She was sitting on the bedroom floor with the baby, and she read that, and she was not a woman who cried easily or often, but the particular pressure behind her eyes that she recognized was building in a way that did not care about her preferences. She read the last letter, the one dated the day before he came. It said only, "I am coming tomorrow. I have no excuse. I am coming anyway." She sat for a long time. When Clarence came in from the afternoon work, she was in the kitchen with supper on, the same as any other day, and Robert was in his basket, and Elias was at the table with his slate, and Francis was sitting in the kitchen doorway, conducting a very serious one-sided conversation with the barn cat, who had apparently followed Elias inside. He came in and washed his hands at the basin and took his hat off, and she looked at him across the kitchen and said, "I found the letters." He was still for a moment. Not guilty, she thought, not afraid. Still in the way of a person who has had something revealed that they had accepted might one day be revealed and had already made their peace with it. "I should have given them to you," he said. "I was not sure you would want them." "Why not?" she said. "They are full of things I said to you when I was not yet sure you still wanted me to be saying them to you," he said. She set down the spoon she was holding. She crossed the kitchen. She looked at him directly, the full, open consideration she gave to things she was about to say truly. "Clarence," she said, "you have been saying those things to me every day for 6 years. With actions, with choices, with the way you listen and the way you show up and the way you just now came in from 12 hours of work in the cold and immediately asked me if I needed anything before you sat down." He was watching her with the look. "I have not always been good at saying it back," she said. "I have reasons for that which you know, and they are real reasons, but they do not change what is true." She paused, and she felt the shutter, the old one, and she pushed it open deliberately. "I love you. I have loved you for a very long time, and I am telling you plainly so that you know." He was not entirely steady. "I love you," he said, and his voice was the low, unhurried voice she had heard in her kitchen on a rainy October night years ago. But there was nothing careful or held back about the way he said it. "I have loved you since before I had any reasonable right to." She put her hands on either side of his face, which was rough from the day and warm from the kitchen, and she stood on her toes and kissed him with the full, unguarded intention of a woman who has decided that the careful life has earned its expansion, that the fenced-off sections are no longer necessary, that the light coming in through the open shutter is worth every accompanying draft. Elias from the table said, "Mama is kissing Papa." He said it the way a scientist notes a data point, without judgment, with interest. Francis from the doorway said, "Again," in a tone of approval. The barn cat said nothing. The summer of 1889 was fine and sufficient, the kind that builds without drama. Violet returned to the classroom in March and found that Dorothea Wells had not merely maintained the school but had improved 3 aspects of it, which she said so plainly, and promoted Dorothea to co-teacher, dividing the students by age, which was something she had wanted to do for 2 years and now had the staffing to accomplish. The ranch continued to expand in the measured, deliberate way Clarence had always run it, not overextending, not chasing the speculative money that made some ranchers temporarily wealthy and subsequently broke, but building solid ground year by year. He bought an additional 300 acres in the fall, contiguous land that gave them access to a second creek and better winter shelter for the herd. Elia started school in September of 1889, which was a significant event in the Redmond household, not only for the obvious reasons, but for the additional complexity of a child attending the school taught by his mother, which Elias navigated with a 5-year-old's perfect absence of self-consciousness, and which the other children found entirely unremarkable, because Violet had been their teacher for years and was simply part of the landscape. She kept the letters. She kept them in the cedar chest where she had found them, the whole bundle, and sometimes in the evenings when Clarence was working at the kitchen table on the ranch accounts, and the children were in bed and the house was in its nighttime quiet, she would read one, not always from the beginning, sometimes from the middle of the bundle, a specific November letter or a January one, and she would feel the shape of that 6 months from his side of it, the specific loneliness and fear and wanting. And she would look up from the letter at the man at the table and feel the full, present weight of all that had been built since. He always seemed to know when she had been reading. He would look up from the accounts with the look and she would put the letter back in the chest and come back to the kitchen, and that was that. The decade turned. 1890 came in cold and clear over the caprock, and Millhaven had by this point become something more established than it had been when Violet arrived. A gas lamp on the main street, a second bank, a public library that she had been instrumental in organizing, and that occupied a small building between the 2 churches. The railroad spur had been expanded. The school had 4 teachers for what were now 68 students. The town had stopped feeling like a place still deciding whether it was going to survive and started feeling like a place that knew it would. Robert was walking, and then running, and then climbing everything in the house, and the barn and several things outside that were not designed to be climbed, with an enterprise that exhausted everyone around him and delighted Clarence specifically. Frances, at 4, had appointed herself Robert's primary authority figure, and managed him with a combination of bribery and genuine love that was both effective and amusing. Elias was in school and reading well ahead of his grade, and conducting a quiet, meticulous campaign to be allowed to help with the cattle, which Clarence had been introducing him to in small pieces since the previous fall. Spring 1890 brought the first significant illness of their shared life, which was Violet contracting a respiratory illness in March that kept her in bed for 2 weeks and frightened everyone, including herself, more than she let on. The doctor came 3 times. Clarence was at her side every morning and evening, managing the house, managing the children, managing the ranch from the porch steps while the foreman Hector ran operations in his absence, and sitting with her in the evenings with his book and the lamp and his steady, undemonstrative presence that was its own form of medicine. She recovered fully by April and returned to the classroom in May with the specific, sharp appreciation for ordinary life that comes after you have had it threatened. The bluebonnets were in that spring, covering the low ground west of the ranch house, and one morning she went out alone in the early light before the children woke and stood in the middle of them with the sky above her and the ranch behind her, and the smell of coffee coming from the kitchen where Clarence was already up. And she felt, with the total clarity of a woman who has made it to the other side of several kinds of fear, that this was the life. Not a preparation for a life, not a careful management of a life. This specific morning, this exact blue, this, She went back inside. He was at the stove with the coffee. "The bluebonnets are in," she said. "I know it," he said. He handed her a cup. "Thought you might want to see them this morning." "You sent me out intentionally," she said. "I thought you looked like you needed a few minutes with them," he said. She held her coffee with both hands and looked at him with the full, open look she had learned not to fence off. "You know me very well," she said. "I have been paying close attention for 9 years," he said. "That is true," she said. "Are you well?" he said. He always asked. He had asked every morning since the illness, not anxiously, not with the hovering quality that would have frustrated her, but simply. The same way you check on something you value. The same way you do not take for granted the presence of something whose absence you have imagined and found unacceptable. "I am very well," she said, which was true in every dimension, and she stood in her kitchen on a May morning in 1890 and felt the truth of it all the way through. The years that followed built themselves with the accumulated richness of a life being fully lived. The children grew, and the ranch prospered, and the town around them became the kind of place that people looked back on later and said, "That was a good place to have been." Elias, serious and observant, took up the cattle work with his father with a genuine aptitude that pleased Clarence in ways he expressed quietly and consistently. Frances became the kind of girl who had strong opinions about everything and no reluctance to express them, which Violet found both recognizable and satisfying to witness. Robert, the youngest, was physical and bright and managed to be in perpetual motion while also being, when he was still, completely and warmly present. She taught until 1895, when the school had grown to require 3 full-time teachers, and the administration of the whole system had become a separate function, and she transitioned to a role as the district school administrator for the Millhaven area, which suited her capacities in a way that daily classroom teaching no longer could. She missed the children in the specific way you miss the particular for the general, but the work was real and she did it well, and it put her in a position to advocate for things she had been advocating for informally for years: better materials, better pay for teachers, accommodation for the students whose families were struggling, a school calendar that acknowledged the agricultural reality of the families it served. The lending library grew. The Millhaven Public Library opened in 1893 in a proper building, funded partly by a bond and partly by donations that Violet had personally solicited in writing, and in person from every person of means in a 50-mile radius. The cornerstone had both her name and Clarence's on it, because they had given the first and largest donation together, because that was how they did things by then together. The accounts and the decisions and the contributions and the arguments and the resolutions and the particular, irreplaceable companionship of 2 people who have chosen each other not once but every day for 12 years and counting. In 1895, Elias was 11 and beginning to think about what his life would be, the specific, early-forming ambitions of a boy who is paying attention to the world and deciding where in it he wants to operate. He had his father's patience with land and animals and his mother's precision with language, a combination that would, Violet suspected, take him somewhere interesting. Frances was 9 and conducting herself with the directness of a person who had decided early that being a girl was not a categorical limitation, which Violet encouraged with great enthusiasm and Clarence supported with the quiet consistency of a man who had watched his wife make that argument by example for over a decade. Robert was 6 and in school, where he was discovering the specific satisfaction of numbers, a subject in which he moved through the curriculum at a speed that made his teachers use words like remarkable, which Violet received with the combination of pride and amusement of a mother who has watched this child redistribute the household furniture for his own organizational purposes since he was 3. She fell pregnant for the 4th time in 1895, which she and Clarence received with the settled happiness of people for whom this addition has a clear, beloved home. Their second daughter, Clara Jane Redmond, was born in April of 1896, named for Clara Dupree, who had become one of Violet's closest friends over the years of their shared life in Millhaven. James Dupree, when told, wept openly and without any of the self-consciousness he had not had at his own wedding, and Clarence shook his hand for a very long time. Clara arrived into a household that was by now a fully operating community of its own, with 4 children, a dozen ranch hands, a cook named Maria who had been with them since 1891, and who ran the kitchen with serene authority, and 2 dogs who had opinions about everything. She was received by her siblings with the full range of available responses: Elia's scientific interest, Francis's immediate proprietary enthusiasm, and Robert's philosophical acceptance that another person had arrived, and he intended to be useful to her. Violet held her daughter in the April light that came through the bedroom window and thought about an October night in 1882, a rainstorm, a knock on a door, a soaking wet man who stood on her porch and offered nothing but his honest presence and no excuse. She thought about the shutter she had learned to latch. She thought about every time she had unlatched it deliberately, the careful, effortful choice to remain open to the things that mattered, even when openness was harder and riskier and more complicated than the closed alternative. She thought about the answer she had come to after 11 days of deliberate consideration, the yes she had said across a kitchen table. She looked down at Clara Jane, who was a week old and had already developed an expression that suggested strong opinions were forming, and she thought, this, all of this. The people in the next rooms, the land outside the window, the man who would come in from the morning work and ask if she was well and mean it and receive the true answer. This is the answer I chose. This is where it led. Clarence came in at 10:30. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at Violet with the look, unchanged after all these years, the direct and specific and entirely unperformed thing that had been on his face the morning she had let him in from the rain. "How are you?" he said. "I am wonderful," she said, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. He put his hand over hers on the blanket, warm and certain, the hand of a man who had built something real from rough ground and knew how to take care of what he valued. She turned her hand and held his. Outside, the caprock spring was doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent and spectacular, the grass coming in on the south pasture and the creek running clean through the eastern section, and the sky above the Redmond spread going on forever in every direction, the vast and patient and beautiful country that held them. Inside, the kitchen had coffee on. Elias was at the table with his slate. Francis was in the barn with the horses. Robert was counting something in the sitting room, audibly. Clara Jane was asleep in her mother's arms. And Violet Kendrick Redmond, who had stood in her kitchen doorway 12 years ago with a cast-iron skillet, and a heart full of protected secrets and every good reason in the world to keep the door shut, sat in the morning light and held her husband's hand and her daughter's warmth and the complete, resolved, deeply inhabited fullness of the life she had chosen to build the night she made the best judgment call of her life and let him in anyway. The rain had stopped long ago. The door was open. It had stayed open, and everything at last was exactly as it should be.